It's another term for key leaders in Florida. Ron DeSantis faces criticism from Democrats, but celebrates swearing in with a speech pushing the conservative agenda.
Florida shows that results matter.
What does recent history point to in 2023? Political analyst Rick Mullaney joins us on This Week in Jacksonville. And Happy New Year to you. Good to be with you again. Rick Mullaney, founder and now executive director of the Public Policy Institute at Jacksonville University. So, Rick, Ron DeSantis won his election 4 years ago, very slim margin, the most recent election by almost 20 points. We saw him swear in this week in Tallahassee to start his second term. How is the second term different than his first?
Ken, the biggest way it's different is the whole nation is watching because of the consequences for the presidential race. Let's put it in perspective. Back in November, he won by 19 points, the biggest margin in 4 decades in Florida, and a red wave in Florida because he had big coattails. There were 36 governor's races last fall, but the nation is watching the inaugural address in Florida. Why? Because what is Ron DeSantis' future? Is he running for president? Right now, he's in a very good position. He had a big win in November. He's got the wind at his back. He's not going to really make a decision, not expected to, till after the legislative session ends in May. And so everyone's looking to this speech. Can you get a clue or an indicator of what he's going to do? Very strong speech, 15 minutes, did not mention Biden or Trump by name, but clearly he left his options open.
Let's show you some of the video from on Tuesday. And as mentioned, a briefer speech than maybe we would have anticipated. But the question that I got from many people around, okay, is the governor running for president? That's not something he says he wants to focus on right now. Does it take away from what he's trying to do or being a good leader? That's what Democrats say is, hey, if he's focused on the White House, he can't be focused enough on the state of Florida.
Ken, I think in his inaugural speech, he positioned himself well. He didn't mention running for president by name. He didn't mention the others by name, but it was a very strong speech. Like I mentioned, it was 15 minutes, but look at the themes. His record in Florida, freedom, liberty. Florida is where woke comes to die. And then a little bit of a pivot into national policies, talking about government spending and inflation, open borders and immigration. Also talking so much about the other energy policy and Biden policies, and contrasting Florida with other states and Florida with the dysfunction in Washington. And what a week to do it, given what's happened in the speaker's race in Washington, D.C. For Governor DeSantis, this was an opportunity to contrast Florida versus the rest of the nation and D.C. Florida is growing, Florida is prospering. Florida, as he says, has common sense. Very strong speech. And by the way, all the themes are there for a future run if he chooses to do that.
All right. So before we get to that potential future run, what about in Florida? So the swearing in ceremony this week came with Republicans in power in every statewide elected office, supermajority in the House, supermajority in the Senate for Florida. So how does it affect the governor's agenda and trying to get what he wants to get accomplished done?
Kent, it gives him the opportunity to move his agenda forward in a very dramatic way. As you just mentioned, he has supermajorities in the House and Senate. By the way, the cabinet's all Republican. The Congress went that way. Very big sweeping in Florida. In his speech, he talked legislation relating to families, being family friendly, legislation on education, legislation, of course, on the immigration and other areas. So Governor DeSantis is well positioned for this term, but he's also well positioned for potential announcement next summer.
Yeah, so let's talk about that a little bit and kind of take it in 2 blocks here. There's a former president who's in the same party as the Republican governor of Florida. How does Ron DeSantis handle that? Because so far, Donald Trump has come out and said, I'm running for president and don't vote for that guy in Florida. A
couple comments. First of all, Donald Trump announced very, very early, the week after the midterms, and I believe part of it was strategic to make it difficult for the Department of Justice, more difficult, because in 2023, this year, they're going to be making a monumental decision as to whether a former president will be indicted. Second of all, I don't think Donald Trump is in as strong a position this time as he was last time, and particularly when it comes to Governor DeSantis. He is popular with the base. Governor DeSantis is with the base. But that doesn't mean you should underestimate Donald Trump in the primary, because he does have that strong base for Donald Trump. And if the field grows, last time it was 15 to 17. If it's a big field, it favors Donald Trump. This time, I suspect a much smaller field, maybe 5 or 6. You're going to have it much smaller for one of the others to win. But Governor DeSantis is very, very formidable. and Donald Trump is challenged on multiple fronts.
Yeah. So as we get into 2023, some of that will clarify on who's going to run for president. Let's talk about the Democratic side. President Biden gives lots of indications that he wants to run for re-election. Typically, a first-term president, there's no question the party is going to say this should be our person. That's not necessarily the case with Democrats right now.
You know, Kent, if you had asked me prior to the midterms if Joe Biden was running for president, I would have told you unequivocally no. I didn't believe he was. Part of it is simply age. Part of it is lack of popularity in his own party. And part of it is the challenges he was facing. However, the midterms really did work in his favor in many, many ways. He defied history in many ways. The most successful midterm for a first-term president really since John F. Kennedy, not including George Bush following 9/11. Very successful. He defeated the odds. He now has a little bit of the wind at his back. And for Joe Biden, it's his choice. And it appears that he's going to run. Donald Trump, as I mentioned earlier, is still formidable. I don't think the nation is looking for a rematch. I don't think that's what most people want. They would like somebody younger on the Republican and Democratic side, but that remains a distinct possibility and certainly a very strong possibility that you're going to see Joe Biden running again.
Well, let me pivot back to former President Trump. You mentioned the Department of Justice. Where does that stand? Because that is a big decision DOJ will have to make. The Attorney General will have to decide, are we going to go after these charges for a person who's running for president and is the former president?
Kent, when we look forward to the year ahead in 2023 and the big decisions and the big events that will happen in this upcoming year, one of the biggest is the decision by the Department of Justice. Do you or do you not indict the former president of the United States? And not just the former president, a candidate for president of the United States, who, by the way, is running against the person who appointed you as Attorney General for the Department of Justice. So there'll be the vulnerability of a claim of politics. Having said that, the investigations that you've seen, both in the search of his home for the mishandling of classified documents and into January 6th, has been very serious. Some of that evidence is very compelling. So this year, sooner rather than later, expect this big decision from the Department of Justice. It will be historic. It will be consequential.
We will be watching that, absolutely, as we get into the first part of this year. All right, so don't go anywhere. When we come back, we're going to look at another branch of government, the impact from 2022 at the Supreme Court of the United States. That's next on This Week in Jacksonville.
You're watching This Week in Jacksonville with Kent Justice.
And political analyst Rick Mullaney is with us today. So, Rick, what a consequential year in America because of the Supreme Court of the United States. We know that judicial branch is so important, but doesn't usually make headlines like it did in 2022 and what could happen in 23. So let's start with that big decision last summer. Dobbs, Roe versus Wade, and then the trail of what happens after that, I guess.
Kent, if you're looking back at 2022 and what are the most significant and consequential events domestically, what happened in the country, certainly the U.S. Supreme Court case and the Dobbs versus Jackson case is on the list. It was a political earthquake, and as you know, in that case, Dobbs, the U.S. Supreme Court, overturned Roe versus Wade and Planned Parenthood versus Casey, which had modified Roe versus Wade, and basically held in short form that there is not a federal constitutional right to an abortion, overturning the 50-year precedent of Roe versus Wade. This is consequential on politics and on policy. On the politics, immediately it energized the Democratic base, and you could see it last summer. I believe it very much carried over into November and had a big impact on the midterm elections. From a policy standpoint, you saw 50 states, many of them out of position, beginning to pass new legislation. Here in Florida, we had passed a statute last spring allowing abortion up to 15 weeks and banning it after 15 weeks. And in Florida, we also have a Florida constitutional provision that is explicit on the right to privacy, and that is being litigated. But let's go to your main point. The U.S. Supreme Court here in this decision was very consequential, both in terms of public policy and politics.
So it seems like some of that could happen again this year. There are a couple of things that you've mentioned to me. Hey, the Supreme Court is going to rule on this in the future here. Loan forgiveness for student debt and then Title 42. What do you see happening there?
Kent, certainly one of the big discussions that's going on nationally is this conservative court. And of course, the Dobbs decision overturning Roe will have consequences into 2023. But if you're looking to the Supreme Court in 2023, a few cases very high profile to keep in mind. One is a case involving affirmative action in which the admissions practices at Harvard and the University University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, are being called into question. That is one in which you could see a very significant change in direction from where we've been in the past on affirmative action. Another one is on President Biden's loan forgiveness plan, in which in the fall he forgave about $400 billion in loans pursuant to a 2003 statute. And certainly one of the trends in this court is to pull back on the discretion of administrative agencies and the executive branch in terms of their discretion. You saw that in 2022 in a case known as EPA versus West Virginia, in which the court there held back on the ability of the executive branch to transition coal-fired generating plants out to renewable energy pursuant to the 1970 Clean Air Act. And also, keep an eye out on Title 42 and what's going on. That's certainly an argument you're going to hear in February, actually, on Title 42 and immigration policy.
Yeah, and President Biden, that's a big deal for him right now, going to the border this week and trying to establish maybe some different rules about who is allowed in and when and under what processes will happen there. Let's talk a little bit about the midterm elections. We did in our last segment,
yes.
But how does that influence what we're going to see in governance this year?
Well, one of the biggest things you're seeing in governance this year already is the spectacle of the vote for Speaker.
Right.
It's the direct result of what happened in November. In November, the Republicans underperformed. They picked up 9 seats. They were projected to pick up 10 to 20 or more. They underperformed historically and otherwise. If they had had a bigger margin, you would not see the minority of the Republican Party right now basically holding the rest of them hostage.
Because 20 Republicans, if they had a larger majority, wouldn't be able to stop the progress of the vote and all of that.
That is correct. And that is certainly something that has been talked about a great deal, that the smaller margin was going to make it more difficult for whoever was Speaker, whether it's Kevin McCarthy or someone else, to try to govern. But the bigger issue is, when you look back to the midterms, is the Democrats really did defy history. They picked up a seat in the Senate. They have a majority in the Senate. The Republicans now have the House. And so in the Senate, while they'll be able to get their agenda through, having a 51 to 49 margin will help them on committee assignments, on judicial nominations. But in terms of substantive legislation, they're still going to have to get it past the House. And so the House is going to be a challenge in terms of spending and appropriations in particular.
Before we move off that Speaker of the House vote thing, I saw a former Speaker of the Florida House, Jose Oliva, mention this week that, hey, it looks bad, but this is right. This should happen. The founders would be proud of a process that has some of this going back and forth. What do you think about that opinion?
Not so sure. It's been a century. It's been 100 years since we've had even a second ballot. That happened in 1923, 100 years ago, and that was 9 ballots resolved in a few days. We're past that already. Yeah. If you want to go back further, nearly 170 years ago, it took 2 months and 133 ballots. This time, I think it'll be shorter than 133 ballots. I actually think this may relate a little bit to Ron DeSantis. He says, look to the chaos of Washington, D.C. Look to the dysfunction of Washington. Look to the dysfunction in other states and compare that to what we're doing here in Florida. Florida, open for business. Florida, as the governor likes to say, liberty, freedom, and thematically, as he said on election night and in his inaugural, Florida is where woke comes to die. So the Governor DeSantis, is well positioned, and even the specter in D.C. is a good week for Ron DeSantis.
Yeah. All right. Okay, stay with us as we explore the next few months in local politics. There's a high-profile mayor's race with no incumbent. The attack ads have already started. We're going to discuss that. That's next. Stay with us on This Week in Jacksonville.
You're watching This Week in Jacksonville on Channel 4.
And News from Jax political analyst Rick Mullaney is with us. Let's focus on some local politics. This is a big year in the city of Jacksonville where Mayor Lenny Curry is termed out. So 10 candidates filed for mayor so far. And then the top 2 fundraisers, they're already blasting away on TV ads. This has to be just getting started because it's January. The election is in March. It's really close, isn't it?
No question about it, Ken. Keep this in perspective. We have spring elections here in Jacksonville. In the last 30 years, this is the 4th time we will have an open seat for mayor. And historically, it's very, very close. John Delaney in 1995 won by 1%. John Payton in the first election won by less than 2% in 2003. Alvin Brown won by 1% in 2011. Now we have an open seat, no incumbent this time. This is going to be competitive, it's going to be hard fought, and it will capture the attention of the entire community. Some of these candidates are particularly well funded. It's a strong group of candidates. It's a very consequential election in terms of the future of Jacksonville. As I've said a number of times, I personally am very optimistic about the future of the city overall, the future of downtown and where we're heading. But great leadership is important, and whoever wins this race will be in a very important part of Jacksonville's future. It's going to be a competitive race, very hard fought.
It's different with these municipal elections. It's not like the federal ones. There's not a primary, but there's this first unitary election. Why do we see Republicans attacking Republicans in this case?
Well, it's pretty simple in many ways. First of all, you mentioned it's unitary. That means Republicans and Democrats run together. And the simple formula is 2 get to advance to the runoff. And so what you're going to do is you want to be in the top 2. It's as simple as that. If you don't make it to the top 2, you're out. And so here, the 2 best funded with the greatest fundraising are Daniel Davis and Leanna Cumber. And therefore, you've already seen those ads begin between the 2 of them. And you can see that it's very, very competitive. One of the things that will be interesting, Kent, is to take a look at Duval County, which has been trending blue in the past few elections. But last fall, a big red wave that also included Duval County. But remember, Duval County is 31% black, which is predominantly Democratic. And so on the Democratic side, if you can turn out the vote, you're very, very competitive. So the reason you may see Democrats going after Democrats and Republicans going after Republicans is there may be a sense that possibly, although it's unitary, 1 Republican will advance, 1 Democrat will advance, and the whole goal here is to be in the final 2 for the runoff.
So let's talk about the Democrats. It seems like Donna Deegan and Audrey Gibson have the biggest name recognition among those Democrats who filed for mayor.
They clearly have the greatest name recognition, and they're both very formidable, and they bring different backgrounds to the table. Certainly with Audrey Gibson, great legislative experience, deep roots in Jacksonville, as does Donna Deegan. I think her experience in broadcast journalism serves her very well. In the first debate, she performed particularly well. And so you have 2 very formidable candidates on the Democratic side, and those are the 2 most high profile.
But the fundraising isn't there like it is for the top 2 Republicans that you mentioned. They're raising millions of dollars. The top mark among the Democrats is, I think, Donna Deegan has $800,000. Well, why the disparity?
Well, for one advantage certainly for Donna Deegan is money is for name recognition, and she does have a bit of name recognition already, so it may not take her quite as much. But in the end, fundraising does matter, and it's very, very helpful. If you're Daniel Davis and you've raised that money, it puts you in a very strong position. Leanna Cumber has also been very strong in her fundraising. Fundraising is what allows you to get the message out. It allows you to get out to the voters, to define yourself, to define your opponent. So don't underestimate the importance of it. But then again, you do have the advantage with Audrey Gibson, all those years in the legislature, and Donna Deegan, both with a little bit of higher name recognition maybe than some of the others.
Let's talk about Mayor Curry. He's got 6 months left. And what kind of things, if anything, can Lenny Curry do in these final 6 months that changes or leaves a legacy for the 2 terms that he served in office as mayor of Jacksonville?
I'm not so sure after 7.5 years there's much you can do in the last 6 months except to be open and be supportive of the new administration coming in. I certainly remember John Payton went out of his way in trying to make the transition effective and trying to be helpful and supportive. And certainly one of the things he can do is whoever is our next mayor is to be supportive and helpful in that transition. But this will be, like I said, it's been 7.5 years for Mayor Curry. Right. So at this point, he's really accomplished about as much as he's going to, I think, other than going through and running the government for the last 6 months.
So in your view, for those 7.5 years, what is the legacy that Lenny Curry leaves as he exits office next summer?
I actually think he can make a pretty strong case that when it came to pension reform, for example, when it came to infrastructure investment, when it came to initiatives downtown that haven't been completed yet but that are on the horizon. He may not be there for the ribbon cutting, and sometimes mayors aren't there for the ribbon cutting, but you put it in motion. I think he can try to make a very compelling case that in a number of areas, the city's finances, infrastructure, downtown, relationships with the Jaguars, that he actually move the city forward. There will be those detractors that point to other areas, sort of maybe some management style issues, as well as the JEA problems and sort of how legislation got through. But if you're Mayor Curry, I think you can point to some fairly strong achievements.
So let's shift focus a little bit here. I want to talk about economy and inflation. This is a national, it's a state, it's a local issue. Each of us feel it. That 40-year high in inflation. Rick, as we look at the Federal Reserve role and the historic rate increases, are lawmakers looking at ways to combat that, address that, or are we as citizens kind of on our own?
Really hard, Ken. Earlier in the program, we were talking about the big stories of 2022 and the impacts for 2023. Really big story for 2022 was inflation, a 40-year high, and of course the Fed reaction in June, July, September, and October, as you mentioned, 75 basis points points raising interest rates, historic increase in interest rates. Why? Because of the concern over inflation. Is there a free lunch in this? There is not, because it increases the risk of a recession. And so nationally, we brace ourselves for the potential in 2023 of a recession. Hopefully not as big an impact in Florida or here locally in Duval County, but we are concerned about that potential. For lawmakers, much of this is structural and very, very difficult. You have a variety of factors, whether it's pent-up demand from the pandemic, the old bottlenecks that hopefully have been addressed on supply chain problems, government spending, gas prices, a variety of sort of a perfect storm of factors led to this 40-year high. But clearly, as we look to 2023, inflation, the economy, and of course the action of the Fed is going to be high on the agenda for everybody.
So final 30 seconds there. Will that play out when it comes to elections, even at this local level when we see in March?
It certainly will play out in elections at the federal level. In the presidential campaign that takes shape in 2023, it will be a big issue. In federal elections, it will be a big issue. I don't know if it's quite as much so, the Republican versus Democrat, not quite as critical at the local level, but the economy, Jacksonville's economy, and big issues. The Jaguars, the new stadium, the development of downtown, infrastructure investment, investing in underserved areas, the river, the future of Jacksonville, education, lots and lots of big issues in the mayor's race.
Rick Mullaney, a Shircliff Executive Director of the Jacksonville University Public Policy Institute. Thanks so much for your time. Great to visit today.
You can.
So next time, Jacksonville woman leads the state's Department of Elder Affairs. I'll sit down with Michelle Branham to understand how the agency is working to try and help millions in Florida. This Week in Jacksonville airs each Sunday morning at this time. I'm Kent Justice. Thanks for watching on air on Channel 4 and the CW17, and then online at news4jax.com or streaming on News4Jax Plus. And if you're only joining me Sundays for This Week in Jacksonville, you are missing out. Be sure to subscribe to my weekly Twidge newsletter. It's a real bonus for News4Jax insiders. Head to news4jax.com/newsletters, and then you click to sign up under This Week in Jacksonville.
See why every day more people are choosing News4Jax, Northeast Florida and South Georgia's #1 source for local news.